Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place where you get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. Now, this is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors Chris Thome, Andy Hogan, Dendrick Cooper, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's skip over to the second article, titled Mode of Transport and Pre-Hospital Interventions in Urban Penetrating Trauma, a systematic review and practice management guideline from the Eastern Association for the Surgery of Trauma, out of the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. I love this introduction. It's kind of funny the way they word things. They say that for some select patients, pre-hospital interventions are undoubtedly beneficial. But then they're surprised and shocked that for some select patients with penetrating trauma, pre-hospital interventions are not helpful. Gasp. Of course, if you're going to word it that way, it means nothing. But what they really want to get down into in this paper is that in some scenarios, scoop and run is the best thing that you can do. The stay and play approach is not appropriate for every patient. And so in this mindset, if what really matters is transporting you to the hospital as quickly as possible, then whether you went by EMS or by police or by someone just took you in their car, it shouldn't matter. And indeed, we might expect you to do better if the police or just a random passerby takes you to the hospital, because they're going to do it quickly and they're not going to try to do any medical intervention. So you might actually be better served by not having an EMS team. Also, those people might be on scene sooner than waiting for EMS. And so everything might be better if you just get that patient to the hospital as quickly as possible. And that's what these authors wanted to weigh in on. That's what they did a systematic review for. In the case of specifically urban setting patients who have penetrating traumas, are they better off just getting to the hospital as quickly as possible, not waiting for EMS? Or, should we wait for the ambulance like we normally do? They tried to answer this question for two separate transport options, that is by police or by private vehicle, which is just anybody. Now, already, East recommends a few things that try to not delay the care of these patients to get them to the hospital faster. Like not recommending that you use C-collars in patients with penetrating neck injuries, and do not place IVs on scene, do them en route if you have to place an IV, and do not give them fluids en route either. Just wait to get them blood, because blood is what they need. So already there's a few recommendations that are out there to try to not delay getting these patients to the hospital. Now, they only had 6 studies looking at the police transport and 2 for private vehicles, but they were still able to make at least some kinds of recommendations. Now, for police transport, you seem to have pretty much the same odds of survival as EMS transport unless you are severely injured, in which case you actually benefit by being transported by the police. That is to say, get to the hospital as quickly as possible. For private vehicle transport, this suggests actually an overall survival benefit to EMS transport, and this is probably because it happens, boom, you're right there, you go. You're not waiting for the police to show up or the EMS. There's probably a vehicle that's already on scene. Get that person to the hospital. And so these authors were able to make the official recommendation that there's a conditional recommendation for non-ambulance transport in these patients who are in an urban environment and have penetrating trauma, to get them as quickly as possible to the hospital, because what they need is blood and a surgeon. In light of these results, it seems like some EMS services might want to, change some of their recommendations around this. Of course, it's not like they're going to not show up, but, if you call 911, 911's advice might be for these, penetrating trauma patients to not wait for the ambulance, take that person to the hospital as quickly as possible. This could make a difference for them. In a spoonful, these guidelines conditionally recommend to scoop and run for urban penetrating trauma patients with police or private vehicle transport to the hospital without waiting for EMS. Okay, then let's get into the fourth article, titled Tenecteplase for Acute Ischemic Stroke at 4.5 to 24 hours, a meta-analysis of randomized control trials, out of the journal Stroke. Now, we've covered similar about this before. We even covered the HOPE RCT, which showed that there is some signal that it would be beneficial to treat patients with thrombolysis who are outside the typical 4.5-hour window for a stroke, up to 24 hours. The trial is looking at TNK, which seems to be the more favored thrombolysis agent these days. And so what about TNK? Is TNK also going to show us this benefit? Well, they found 4 RCTs totaling almost 1,300 adult patients with acute ischemic strokes who received TNK somewhere between 4.5 and 24 hours. 3 of the trials were done in China and the last one in North America. And what did they find? Well, for the primary outcome of standard for this kind of trial, excellent 90-day neurological outcomes, that's a modified Rankin scale of 0 to 1, there was indeed an improvement if you were treating these patients with TNK, an odds ratio of 1.34, which gives you a number needed to treat in the end of 17. Which really isn't that bad. It does not approach anywhere near how good EVT is because, if you're actually going to take out that clot, then you've got a number needed to treat of like 2 or 3. But still, this is helping some patients. And what about bleeding, you ask? Well, for symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage, the number needed to harm was 72. So the balance of harm to benefit seems to favor actually giving the TNK in this case. When EVT is on the table, however, functional outcomes are not better. You do see higher rates of vessel recanalization, but what we care about is functional outcomes. So if EVT is available, then you want EVT. If EVT is not on the table, then it does seem to be that TNK is beneficial for these patients, at least from the data that we have so far. All mostly, not enormous trials, but we still have some data. I'm not sure how long it's going to take for guidelines to catch up with this or for this to become regular practice, but this is going to be a big change. Because typically when I see a stroke patient who's coming in, outside the window, then they get treated, not that they should be treated that differently, but they get treated a little bit differently, right? Because that there's not necessarily that same option available to them. Sure, if they have a large vessel occlusion, they can go to EVT. Of course, you should still do a code stroke and treat them very quickly. But that thrombolysis is not on the table. Now, if it is on the table, then this is going to change the way some people practice. This is going to change some of the protocols as well. This is going to change the urgency for a lot of these patients because you're still going to want to do that treatment probably as soon as possible. In a spoonful, it seems that TNK given out to 24 hours after stroke onset does seem to give some benefit to these patients. Number needed to treat of 17. This will probably make its way to guidelines eventually if the data on this stays in this direction. Okay, let's do a quick review of everything we talked about. And then from the second article, scoop and run for the win for urban penetrating trauma patients. Don't wait for EMS, just get that patient to the hospital, be it by private vehicle or police. Then from the fourth article, TNK up to 24 hours from onset of stroke is probably more good than it is harmful for our patients. And so this is potentially practice changing, probably with a little bit more research in this regard, we might see guidelines catch up. All right, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed. So you missed 3 articles from this past week. If you want to hear a longer podcast with more articles covered every week, then you have to become a member. Here's some of the things that you missed. We talked about private equity and if it affects our patients. Then we talked about how often we're appropriately treating opiate use disorder in the emergency department. And then finally, the rundown on what are the best screening tools for large vessel occlusion strokes. Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding. Thank you.